All right, so we're going to talk about a few more things in this demonstration. We're going to move forward, and first thing we're going to talk about is opacity. So if I wanted to take this postmark, for instance, I would select the postage or postmark layer, and in the layer panel, you'll notice up here there's an opacity level, and you can either click the drop down and choose a slider and kind of figure out the opacity from there, or you can also just directly type in a value. And so if I do that, it'll be like 25% or something, you know, however you want to do that. So that's how you can adjust opacity. We'll talk about fill in a minute. You might get opacity and fill a little bit confused, and one of the things I'll show you right off the bat is if I hit 100% opacity, but then I change it to 25% fill, you might go and say, well, that basically it's the same thing. Well, it looks very similar, but there are a few things that are different about opacity and fill. And I want you to understand the key things that are really important in that you typically are going to want to adjust the opacity for most things. The opacity literally is about how opaque something actually is versus transparent. And if you change the fill instead of the opacity, for instance, and then later you decide that you want to do something with video in the video timeline, then what you'll have to do is you'll have to undo all of the fill changes and you'll have to reverse them so that instead of like a 25% fill, that instead you change that to 100% fill and then change the opacity to 25%. Because for instance, if you do video in Photoshop and you make changes across a timeline, it will only track the opacity, it won't track the fill, for instance. Another thing that is important to understand about fill is that there are some blend modes, and we'll talk about blend modes in just a second, but there's some blend modes that actually will behave differently when the fill has been adjusted versus the opacity. So on the surface, at first, you know, you're going to look and see these two things and not really understand how they're different because they look very similar when you adjust each one of them. Or adjust one as opposed to the other. And so just know that there is a difference, and typically you want to be adjusting the opacity unless you are very intentionally adjusting the fill instead. Okay, so the next thing that we can also look at doing then is working with something I mentioned just a minute ago, which is blend modes. Let's turn off the visibility of these layers right here, and let's look at this pineapple. This pineapple right now is, I'm going to select the pineapple layer. It's a really nice selection. It's a very, you know, sort of good looking pineapple, but it sort of is a little bit dull. It could actually have a little bit more contrast and a little bit more vibrance. And so one of the things that we could do is I'll take this pineapple layer and I can drag it to this new page icon. That's what this little page icon is right here. It's got like the corner of it in the bottom left folded up. That's a page icon. Now what I can do with this pineapple copy is I'm going to actually change the name of it from pineapple copy to pineapple, and I'll call it blend mode. All right, so the one on the top is going to have a blend mode, and what that means is that when I apply a blend mode, and the blend mode options are all right here in the layer panel, so you have to select the correct layer. But basically what that means is that any anything that you choose here, it's going to have the color and the pixels and the luminance, depending on what you choose, it's going to have these pixels interact differently with the pixels that are directly beneath it. All right, so that's pretty important. So like if we wanted to choose, for instance, like an overlay, you can see that immediately it just pops that color up. It gives it a little bit more saturation in the yellows and greens, and it gives it a depth and, you know, sort of a much greater depth in the crevices, right? It just gives it a lot more contrast and pop. Okay. Now, one thing I would suggest that you kind of experiment is see what happens when you change different ones. Like you could choose from overlay to soft light, and you can kind of see how differently it behaves. And you'll notice that some of them don't behave that differently. Like vivid light, it really pushes the boundaries of saturation and and tonal contrast, and so that's a little bit too deep, but you can see how that might be helpful in some situations. And you don't always want the blend modes to, you know, necessarily be just based on the exact same image. You could have something else, blending with something beneath it. It's totally different. Like this hard light one, it kind of gives it this really posterized feeling. Posterization, by the way, is where you sort of take a picture and you break it down into a very small number of its most elemental tones. This is probably a posterization somewhere in the ballpark of like maybe, I'm going to just take a guess of like maybe 6 basic values, right? So we've got a specific yellow, a specific red, a specific green, black, white. There might be some other ones in there. So yeah, anyway, that's a hard mix. You can look at difference. Difference is basically just, in this particular case, it's doing a knockout, exclusion, right? And so one of the things that you can do, and you're not, at first you're not going to really understand what all these different things are doing, and you might look at this and go, I really don't understand all of these. Yeah, they're cool. They have some really cool effects. If I go to darken, for instance, it doesn't seem like it does anything. Right, multiply darkens it, even though darken didn't. And so you might look at some of these and really be confused as to how they're working, okay? And if that's the case, I want to point you, I'm going to go ahead and click on overlay and we'll just leave it at that. But I want to point you to a website you can check out, and there is a it's on Adobe's website. By the way, Adobe has a website that's called helpx.adobe.com. And if you wanted to go there, you could do a search for blend modes and or blending mode descriptions, and you would find something. Probably you'd find this page among potentially other pages. And this is kind of nice because it gives you a really specific description of what these different blend modes are supposed to be doing, so that you have a better understanding of how it's like interacting with the values that are beneath them. So one of the things it also says is that you need to make a special note right here, that there are certain blend modes that are only available um, uh, excuse me, I should say, the only ones that are available for 32-bit images are certain blend modes. Okay, so that's just something to keep in mind. Anyway, but you can look at all these different ones, and for instance, if we were to go down to overlay, all right, you can read what it's doing in our overlay, and I'll even expand this a little bit so you can see it better. In the video it says multiplies or screens the colors depending on the base color. So patterns or colors overlay the existing pixels while preserving the highlights and shadows of the base color. All right, so basically you're taking the same picture, you're putting on top of itself, and you're amplifying the highlights and the shadows of the base color. All right, and then it says the base color is not replaced, but mixed with the blend color to reflect the lightness or darkness of the original color. So basically it's just amplifying the tones and bringing them out so that it is more pronounced. And then there's another article, if you wanted to check this out, that actually gets down into the math. If you're that person who really cares, a lot of you are just not going to care enough to look at this, but this is actually kind of a good article. If you wanted to look at it, it actually goes into a lot of the explanation of this stuff, but then it actually does get into the math, for instance. And as I said, a lot of people are just not going to care about a lot of this, but it also does have some basic other descriptions as well. Okay, so back to the Photoshop document. All right. Okay, so now that we have that part done, let's go ahead and let's turn some other elements back on, all right, so we can see what we've got here. And the next thing I would like to do is I would like to go ahead and position this this image of the beach, where ideally I would like for it to go. And I can turn off the Hawaii word and make sure that I've got this kind of positioned in the right spot. And what I would like to do is I want it to be kind of so that the top right corner of it can be just a little bit under, maybe this part of the flower and sort of at an angle. So one of the things I can do, I'll turn off the postage as well. But one of the things I could do is if I want to leave the flower here, but actually not, um, you know, maybe I want to be able to see through it a little bit so I can kind of see what I'm doing. I could also just turn it all, down partially so I could partially see through it, but then I can still see kind of where the flower is, yet at the same time I can also see what I'm doing with this picture. And I'll go back later and I'll adjust the flower's opacity and turn it back up. Your book actually has you turn it off, I think, but I think that might be kind of nice to see compositionally where you're putting this thing. So anyway, I'm going to keep my flower adjusted like that, and then I'm going to select my beach layer over here. And what I'll do is I'm going to transform this photograph. And there are two ways that you can do this. You can either, with the beach layer selected, you can go up to Edit, and you can go to Transform. And you can choose some other version of transformation where you would just choose a single one, or you can just choose free transform. And what's nice about free transform is that it gives you the option of scaling it, it gives you the option of rotating it and doing a whole bunch of different stuff all at the same time. Now, the other thing that you can do to get to that is you can do on a Mac, it would be Command T as in transform, or Control T on Windows. So anyway, what I'm going to do is, first of all, I'm going to kind of scale it. And to scale it, if I just do that, like right like this, that's no good because I'm actually distorting the image. I'm changing the relationship of its ratio, right? I'm making it less wide, and too elongated. So I'm going to undo that by doing Command or Control Z. And I'm still in free transform mode. All right, so what I want to do is I want to click, I get this sort of double-headed diagonal arrow if I click in the bottom right corner. I'm going to click and I'm going to hold down the Shift key at the same time, and I'm going to drag this in, and you see that it, no matter where I move my mouse, right, it still has the proportions constrained, which is really nice. Now, if I wanted to make sure that, I don't know, maybe somewhere in this ballpark, I guess, but if I wanted to make sure that as I was constraining it, if it mattered that I was scaling it inside of the, based off of the center point, I could hold down Option, and then it would scale it so that it basically stays in the center. Sometimes that's really important if you have everything kind of lined up in the center. This is like less important to me, to be honest. So, it doesn't really matter that much. I'm going to lift up off my Option key, and I'll just scale this so that it looks like, it's about the right size for me, somewhere in this ballpark. All right, and then I'll just let up off of my mouse and then my Shift key. And then before I am finished with this, I'm actually going to kind of scoot it down a little bit. Well, I can actually rotate it real quick. See, I get this curved double-headed arrow down in this corner, and I can move it off to the edge. And if I want to constrain it, I can also hold down the Shift key, and then it will constrain it to specific sections, like so it'll go 15, then 30, then 45, and so on. So let's do it somewhere in the ballpark of, like, I don't know, maybe 15% for now, and then you can kind of place it where you think it might make sense, and I think it might sort of make sense somewhere in this, maybe in this ballpark, and maybe I even want to scale it so it's a little bit smaller. So I'll click and hold with the Shift key so that's a little bit smaller, like that, somewhere in that ballpark. It's not rocket science. It doesn't have to be absolutely perfect, but this is kind of what I'm going for. All right, and then when you want to commit to the change that you've made, you hit Return. Okay, you hit the Enter key. Now, one of the things I want to point out to you is that now I have changed this beach image so that this layer is now smaller. So I did what's referred to as a destructive modification to this layer. So if I wanted to save this file and then close it, and then later come back to it, and I looked at this and I said, oh, it's too small, I need to make it bigger. I cannot make this beach image larger anymore once I've saved the file and closed it and reopened it. And the reason is because I just destructively removed a lot of the pixel information by making it smaller. There's a way around that, and the book doesn't go into it in this particular lesson, but the way around that is, instead of just dragging your image from one file into another file like we did here, what you can also do instead is you can use smart objects where you would say file and then you would say place linked or place embedded. And basically what it does is it preserves the original document's resolution, but inside this file. There are some complexities with that because then it limits you to the kinds of things that you can do to that layer unless you were to, undo it so that it's not smart and you would do what's called rasterizing it. That's kind of getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but I do want you to know the difference. And I do want you to know that there is a way to do it where you're preserving the original resolution so that you can scale it up and down. But the way that we did it, it destroys that resolution after we've made this change, save the file, and then close the file. At this point, I could still go into my history and I could undo it so that, I go back to my original files information, and it hasn't been completely destroyed yet. But again, once I save it and close it, it's done. Okay. All right, so the other thing too that I don't want to forget to do is with this flower layer, let's go ahead and turn it back all the way up to 100% opacity. All right, now something else too that we can do, the book shows you how to do, is how you can create a fabricated cloud sky pattern in the background. So to do that, what we want is behind the pineapple, we want to go ahead and generate a pattern. So what we can do is select the white background because we want to make a new layer. This is the new layer icon right here where I have my hand cursor. And if I click on that, it creates a brand new blank layer. And so I'm going to double click this and call it sky, rename it as sky layer. And then to use a filter effect that's going to generate an automated cloud pattern and sky pattern, I need to actually set the color over here to blue for the foreground color. Okay, so where it's black right here, that's the foreground color, and then down below is the background color. So if you hover, it'll actually give you a tooltip that says set foreground color. So I'll click on the black, and I want to put it in the range of blue somewhere in here, and then I can kind of come over here and start to look to see about the right color of blue that I think might work for me. And if if you want to just follow specifically from the book, you can go into the book, and I think the values are something like 48, 138, and 174. So if you wanted to do that, it would be your RGB values right here. So I'm pretty close at 46, and if you wanted specifically, like the 138 range, we could type that in. All right, and that's sort of a slightly different blue. And then the 174 would be the blue here. And so, if you wanted to type that in, it'll give you a really specific blue. I kind of actually liked my 200 value that I had before. Anyway, so I'm just going to go ahead and click OK to that. It doesn't have to be exactly the same as the book. I want you to understand what's more important than typing exact values that the book does is that I want you to understand why the book is using the values that it uses, and it doesn't a lot of times always explain why you have to do a certain thing or why you have to type a certain value in. Anyway, so if I go up here now with my blue foreground color selected, I can go up here to where it says filter, and by the way, you want to make sure you still have sky selected. Anyway, so I'll go to filter, and then if I go to render, I can go here where it says clouds, right? And then it creates this cloud background for me. And it's really kind of hard to tell, but this cloud background is kind of fine for what we're doing right here. But in general, if you were to look at that cloud background, like on a really huge file, and you didn't have a lot of other stuff in front of it, it might really look very fake. And it doesn't always work really well, but it's working pretty well for this. Okay. All right. And so there we've got our background for sky. You want to go ahead and save your file. And then the next demonstration, we're going to move on to how we can start to manipulate some other things, including like typography, and later we'll get to the flower duplication, stuff like that.